On Monday, April 8th, the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago hosted an event entitled What's Next for the Republican Party. Moderator Chris Wallace talked to influential conservatives, including Haley Barbour, Bill Kristol, Mike Murphy, Beth Myers, and Ramesh Ponnuru, about what's next for the Republican Party and how the party can advance going forward so that they can recapture the White House. Joining me today to talk about the event and how the Republican Party can move forward and regain strength and be able to win a presidential election again is Eric Wessan, who's a member of the College Republicans and on the advisory board at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. Eric, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So Eric, the Republicans have lost the popular vote in 5 out of the past 6 presidential elections. First, does the Republican Party need to modernize, and what do they need to do in order to modernize?
So this is a difficult question because on the one hand, you don't want to change anything or any of the values the Republican Party wishes to embody. Similarly though, we have a changing electorate and some things seem to be very different moving forward. In 2004, Bush was able to use gay marriage, for instance, as a wedge issue to win over Ohio and potentially then the election. Today, almost all voters under the age of 30, even in the Republican Party, are for gay marriage. So to have a party that has a stance and in opposition to its future voting base is very dangerous. Once people start to establish a tendency to vote for a party, they stick with it, which is why you used to have all those yellow dog Democrats in the South.
So you touched upon gay marriage, and there's quite a few other issues where it seems like Republicans, at least those that are under 30, are moving in a more libertarian direction. And so my question is, do you think we'll see the rise of the libertarian movement even further, and possibly Rand Paul running for the presidential election in 2016?
So I think there are two aspects to that question. One is, I would say there is definitely a more libertarian lean to a lot of young Republicans, but I'd say gay marriage actually probably is not necessarily one of them. Marriage, at its core, is a very traditional institution, so the expansion of that institution, albeit to a group that traditionally hasn't had it, could be seen more as a way of trying to stabilize family structures, something that's very important in this country, because the best indicator for future success of a child, besides being with its biological parents, is being in a stable home. That being said, when it comes to Rand Paul in 2016, I think at this point he definitely seems to be trying to feel the waters, and there definitely seems to be a market for him. The only question is whether or not that market is enough to make a difference. But I think you'll definitely see him, maybe similarly to his father, running for president a couple times to varying amounts of success.
Mm-hmm. One of the very important issues to a lot of people right now is gun control with the recent incidents of gun violence in Sandy Hook in Newtown. And the question is, why, when so many Americans, over 90% of Americans, support universal background checks, Republicans are so resistant to having a debate on gun control and having any new gun control basically even put in proposal by the people in the Senate. It seems like every time there's such a huge majority of Americans for something, the Republicans are still against it. Why is there such a reluctance when the vast majority of the Americans support universal background checks, and even the vast majority of NRA members support universal background checks? I believe it's at 84%.
So here's another problem. First off, it's very difficult to conflate universal background checks with increased gun control. But we can talk about both of those.
Well, Republicans do.
Not necessarily. But let's start off with talking about universal background checks.
Right.
I'm pretty sure 2 days ago, Senators Pat Toomey and Joe Manchin actually came out with a compromise they liked. But surprisingly, one of the
But
people
that's two senators, and one of them is a Democrat.
Yeah, that's the point, is it's a compromise. If you don't have a compromise, you're not going to have a plan that both sides like. But moving forward, one of the biggest groups that was against the universal background checks as they were originally proposed was the ACLU, not exactly known as a conservative organization. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are for universal background checks, but if you don't think about what it means to have a database full of people's private information that otherwise people would not have access to that now they would, that's a very dangerous, scary thing. The ACLU was worried that as it was proposed without proper controls in place, there would be a whole lot of private information in the hands of people
But
that shouldn't have it.
regardless of what the ACLU thinks or doesn't think, only 16 Republicans voted to actually stop the filibuster of gun control legislation. There were only 2 Democrats, okay? The vast majority of Democrats are for, they were not influenced by the ACLU. The ACLU had no influence in this debate among Democrats. They certainly might have had influence among Republicans, even though I doubt that to be the case. But certainly the case was that it was 16 Republicans. The only 16 Republicans voted to end the filibuster so that gun control legislation could even be debated.
Okay, so let's think about this another way, right? So you want to talk about gun control in the wake of Sandy Hook, but what gun control measures being discussed would have stopped Sandy Hook from happening? You have a woman who, with background checks, bought her guns legally, and her crime was not securing them from her mentally unstable son. And that's an issue, that's a big problem. But the legislation that's being bandied about, like an assault weapons ban, a cap on ammo clips, universal background checks, none of that would have stopped Sandy Hook. And even more important than that is, if, for instance, the case of Hidayah Pendleton, Michelle Obama was recently talking about this in Chicago.
Right here in Chicago.
A vast majority of murders, obviously not including suicides, due to gun violence, are actually due to situations that would also not be prevented by these bans that we're putting in place. We need to help make the streets safe. We need to help make people go into a street
okay,
safe
I understand your point, but furthermore, just because one particular issue, one particular law isn't addressing each particular case doesn't mean that that's not a reason for laws that the majority of Americans support.
So, maybe, but once again, you have to realize that oftentimes there's this thing in Washington called unintended consequences. So one unintended consequence of the universal background checks, as they were first proposed, would be a national registry with lots of information.
But there is no national registry, so it's that's
so when you do a universal
point.
Background check, do you know what that entails?
Yeah.
You have to submit lots of information, right? They look into your history, right?
But there are
And so the
there
issue
are
was,
background checks right now. The question is should the 40% of guns that are purchases without universal background checks have to require background checks?
I understand that.
Right.
And the issue with the original bill, as it was put forward by Harry Reid or described, was there were not controls. They were changing the background check rules. They would be storing people's private information. And
but
I think that's
not
terrible.
the case anymore. So now
do you know why that's not the case? Because Pat Toomey
because
and Joe
every time
Manchin sat
people
down
get
and came to a compromise.
Right, but let's move on because you made your point. I want to now turn to the immigration reform bill.
Okay.
Or basically the lack of a bill. And the question is, why is this another issue where, for example, in the event at the University of Chicago, the Institute of Politics, there was a lot of discussion, especially by Beth Myers, about talking about how Romney's self-deportation line was so damaging to Romney's ability to win over Latinos and other minorities, as we've spoken about before. So why, when it has become obvious, at least to very high up Republicans, that the inability to attract immigration, basically minorities and those who have immigrated to this country to vote for them, why it has been so difficult to still get a bill on immigration reform?
Well, I mean, I think it's very important, this seems to be the second issue where this has happened, not to confuse political expediency with good legislation. And if you look at some of the people that are leading on this issue, for instance, Marco Rubio, there's this Gang of Eight, which has Republicans and Democratic members. They're trying to come out with a good bill, and they're trying to come out with a bill that makes everyone happy. I mean, on the one hand, you have the very conservative U.S. Chamber of Commerce that wants to liberalize immigration. On the other hand, you have unions like the AFL-CIO, which are traditionally very liberal, that are against any sort of opening of or easing of immigration rules. You need to get both sides to come to the table and come out with a solution that works before you can have a bill, and to kind of just rush into it is very dangerous.
Which is probably true with any issue, but the thing is, Republicans were the ones, at least at the event we attended, because it was addressing the Republican Party, that were addressing how important it is to win back the Latino vote and those who have immigrated to this country, such as the Asian vote, because they've lost that vote. But I think the last thing I want to mention is that once again, it's not entirely clear that it's because of the AFL-CIO's influence over Democrats that we're not getting an immigration reform bill, because as Politico reported this past week, it was the conservatives standing up privately and publicly in the Senate and in the Congress in their conference meetings, speaking out and saying, I think we're moving too quickly, as you said, but also that any serious deal on immigration will prevent us from ever winning a presidential election again.
Well, I mean, if you look at one of the, if you look at one of the young leaders of the Republican Party, Marco Rubio, he'd very obviously disagree with that. And while unnamed senators can have a lot of influence apparently in Politico, they don't necessarily...
Well, there were also some that came out publicly. I know, for example, Congressman Stephen King, I know he's a congressman, but still, there was quite a few that were listed that were publicly opposed to immigration reform.
If you want, I can have for you tomorrow a list of Democrats that are publicly opposed to increased immigration, and they'd be mostly from manufacturing states, but...
As we talked about, right.
Yeah.
So, finally, we want to talk about gay marriage as we kind of close where we started. And the question is, we now have, I think, all the Democrats, except for maybe all Senate Democrats, except for I think maybe 3, who have come out in support of gay marriage. And there are now 2 Republican senators who have voiced their support for gay marriage. And the question is, as was discussed in the event we attended, why more Republicans are not on board with this gay marriage movement, I guess, and the opportunity to attract those that are gay and support gay marriage to their party.
Well, so here's the thing, and I think this has been an issue with each of these 3 areas we've addressed. Republicans are not just going to change their views because the polls change. And especially with this issue with gay marriage, I think there's a severe issue where these are people, typically, due to demography, all senators are older, a little whiter than average. They may not know that many gay people. For instance, Rob Portman, when his son came out, that led to his evolution on the issue.
Right.
But it's important to remember that 2 years ago, there were, I think, 2 Democrats in the Senate, and not including the president, the vice president, almost no public figures were for gay marriage.
Right.
This is an issue that is at the forefront and is very important, but it's an issue that people need to be educated on. People aren't just going to change their opinion, at least in the Republican Party, because they have polls. In fact, one thing that I was kind of surprised was, if all these Democrats were for same-sex marriage for so long, why weren't they for it openly? This is a cause that I think is very important on a civil rights basis. And if this is what these people have believed, then I think it's really a travesty that they haven't gone out in front and pushed it harder earlier. And the Republicans, I think, need to get there, but I think that they are going to need people to show them the way, and I think that it would have made it a heck of a lot easier if the people that already had these inclinations were open about it from the beginning.
Right. Nevertheless, though, it remains curious as to why when this party, the Republican Party, seems to be shrinking and losing votes and trying to attract more people, there is still a lot of anti-gay rhetoric coming out of the party. As we know, this past week, the Republican Party, when they were working on their, their party platform, once again voted against having same-sex marriages. Politico reported, with no debate, the Republican National Committee voted unanimously here Friday to reiterate the party's opposition to gay marriage. So it's just curious as to why there seems to be such pushback. What they could say, we're not going to put it in our platform and not make an official party statement on this issue. But what they've decided to do is be so anti-gay that it's almost incredible, and you'd wonder how that's going to attract more voters.
Yeah. Well, your coloration aside, first off, not a party platform.
No, it is. The Republican National Committee voted unanimously to place to put on the party's opposition to gay marriage.
It was a different document, but party platforms only come out during presidential elections and conventions. But I did
so
see
the
that
party
they voted,
stands, right?
Yeah, so what you're saying is a group of very traditional Republican operatives who are unelected in a room in an off year with no kind of agitation voted the way they voted for the past 30 years. And if you think that's surprising,
right,
then you probably should do some reading. And I think that this is an issue that is coming to the forefront, and you will see change, but you start seeing it at the grassroots first, and it travels upwards, and as time moves on, and more people make their preferences clear, and more people, I think, are on the right side of this issue than on the wrong side of this issue, you'll get Republican elected officials that are for gay marriage. It's just going to take a little bit.
The question is, will it be too late? But we'll see.
Will it be too late?
Will the party have been totally marginalized? It won't even matter.
After Watergate, 13% of Americans identified as Republican. As Haley Barbour said before the panel, that was really staring the coffin in the face. They had a committee to see whether or not they should rename the Republican Party.
Right.
Today, a majority of state legislatures, 30 governors, almost half the Senate are Republican. The Republican Party's been in a lot worse place than it is now, and it needs to modernize, but that doesn't mean that it needs to move forward at a breakneck pace. That's not the Republican Party.
That's a great way to wrap up our last question, which is, so who do you see right now as being able to unite the party for 2016 going forward?
I mean, I think that's a very silly question.
Okay.
It's 2012. I think, once again, going to Barbour, he had a bunch of great one-liners. He said in 2004, if someone had said that Barack Obama was going to beat Hillary Clinton in the primary and win the presidency, they would have been laughed off stage or sent to an insane asylum. And I think, I can list off all the names that people are going to talk about. Chris Christie, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, maybe even Mitch Daniels. It looks like Kasich now wants to run. But it doesn't really mean anything. We've got to see kind of where the chips fall over the next couple of years.
And how we go forward. Thanks so much, Eric, for talking to us today. It was a good event.
Yeah, it was a great event. Everyone should come to the Institute of Politics events. They're awesome.
I like the plug. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, good to see you.